Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Josh, and today we're going to talk about how me and my family produce a full-time income thrifting and selling things on eBay in a rural environment. Can it be done? Would the city be better? Let's talk about it. So my wife and I both grew up in a major metropolitan area called Hampton Roads in Virginia, over 1 million people, which means tons and tons of thrift stores. And when my wife started this business back in 2016, she would visit these stores and sell the things on eBay. It wasn't until a few months into it that I realized she was doing pretty well, and I was interested in getting involved myself. And once I did, I got the fever for thrifting, and I loved it. It was so much fun. I already liked thrifting a lot, but thrifting to make money and to actually find really cool things was even cooler. So for the first 6 months of our eBay business, we lived in a major metropolitan area with lots of access to thrift stores. At this time, it was just a side hustle, so it was no big thing. But when we decided to move to the Midwest, otherwise known as the middle of nowhere, for me to go back to school for my degree in economics, we didn't think that the business would be something that would really thrive in a rural environment. But we carried on anyway and did what we could, and surprisingly, 3 or 4 years later, we made this into a full-time income business, still in the middle of nowhere. So how did we do that? And what are all the factors related to it? And would a city be better? So in regards to reselling, I look at the rural and the city environments with these 3 main factors. One is sourcing volume, the other is sourcing quality, and the last one is cost of business. These are the 3 main factors I think that you need to pay attention to when trying to decide whether or not it's even possible in a rural environment or possible in a city environment. So the first one speaks for itself: sourcing volume. How much can you actually get your hands on? How many opportunities are there for you to buy things in a thrift store that you can potentially sell for more online? Well, in a city, there's often millions of people, and then that means hundreds of thrift stores, and that means opportunities abound. And so I think it's fairly obvious right off the bat that the city definitely takes this a little bit from the rural communities. They have so much more access to more stuff. And that's true in our experience when we moved out here to a small town. There were a handful of thrift stores, lots of flea markets as well, but certainly not the number that we could have had access to in Virginia. But this does bring up a different issue in regards to sourcing volume, and that's because there's another major factor that can suck away your opportunities. So all these opportunities you have in the city may not be as opportunistic as you would have put them on paper. And that's because competition. In cities, you have a lot of access, which means you have a lot of other people, maybe just like you, that are looking to potentially do the same job you're doing. So they're looking for the items that you're looking for. They're in all the thrift stores. They're competing with you. And this can be a major drain on the volume that you could potentially get your hands on. Because if you show up an hour late to the thrift store, all the good stuff might be gone. Now here in rural America, and southern Missouri to be specific, that's really not a huge issue. There's very few people that are competing with me for the same products. Definitely very few people, even less, maybe none, competing with me for vintage items in my immediate area. So this is a big drain. So the rural environment actually takes a point back. And so it's fairly even, because while you do have tremendous access to a lot of potential, you also have quite a bit more competition. And this has been so bad for us specifically. There's a town, or city that's pretty large, 2 hours away. We don't even go there anymore because it's so competitive. There's so many people doing what we're doing, and there's a lot of thrift stores, but just not enough opportunity because other people are getting it before we do, so it's definitely not worth our time. And this is sort of the issue I have in most cities, is that the competition is so stiff. If you're not there right as it opens, if you're not there all the time, right when the rack comes out, the volume that you can potentially get your hands on is not nearly as high quality. And that sort of brings up the next element here, and that is sourcing quality, not just quantity, but quality. The quality of the things you can buy. Typically in major metropolitan areas, the the upper crust of the income bracket is higher than in rural communities. Rural communities are typically poor, though not all are impoverished, and there's still plenty of wealthy people out here. But there's just a lot more of them in metropolitan areas. Therefore, what you could find in a thrift store and what they donate could be higher quality, more designer brands, et cetera, et cetera. And that is true. The quality of stuff that I can potentially find, at least frequently, in my area is quite a bit lower than my experience has been in major metropolitan cities. Metropolitan cities, lots of high quality products, a lot of designer. Now, I have found designer clothing out here in the middle of nowhere, believe it or not, but it's certainly not as prevalent or prominent in the location we live in. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat here for the rural communities, a little bit of victory, and that's because there is sort of this phenomenon that when you don't have as much money and you do buy something nice, you hold on to it for a long time. And so this actually kind of works out for us because we do vintage. This sort of pattern for the poor rural communities is that they buy these high quality, valuable items and they hold on to them. Eventually, they sell them or donate them on to the thrift store. And because that's 30 years down the line, there's a lot more vintage. And that was one thing we noticed, is that out here I could find higher quality vintage pieces much easier than in the big cities where that stuff may have already been processed through because people moved, or it was sold because they knew what they had, etc., etc. Now, the next factor that I look at is cost of business. And this has to do with how much it costs you to do business in your particular area. It's about 50% less expensive for us to live, just the basic cost of living here in the Midwest versus where we lived in Hampton Roads in Virginia. It's very expensive there. So all of our costs, housing, gas, food, that stuff is much lower, generally speaking, than it is in Virginia. So rural communities get that point right off the bat. But they also win the next point, and that's the cost of the actual goods you're buying. And that's because of less demand in poorer communities, the prices are much lower than they are in the big cities. So if I'm going to a thrift store and I buy a pair of jeans here in my area, I'll probably spend $2.50, $3. Whereas that same pair of jeans in the big major metropolitan area is probably $6, $8, even $10 sometimes, even at a thrift store. If I'm buying a t-shirt, it's $1, maybe $2 at the most here in the small towns versus $4 in the major cities. So right off the bat, rural wins again with price because it's so much cheaper to actually purchase the items that I'm looking to purchase. But there is a part of this element where the rural community loses this sort of argument, and that's because we're always scrapping for the volume, trying to find as much volume and quality. That means we have to typically go farther. In order to hit 15 thrift stores in a single day, if you lived in a major city, you could probably do it in 6 hours. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I've done it. You can do it. But you can do it in 6 hours, and you don't have to drive all that far. If I want to do 15 thrift stores in a day, I'm driving from 7:30, 8 o'clock, all the way until getting back home at 6 or 7, maybe 8 o'clock in the evening, and driving hundreds of miles, meaning lots of gas money. And if I don't find anything at that one thrift store or that few thrift stores way far away, that's going to be a big, just complete failure in expense rather than any sort of profit. So this is where in rural communities it's hard, because if you're going to try to make a full-time living, you've got to be able to get to a lot of thrift stores, you've got to be able to see a lot of stuff to make up for the lack of opportunity. But it just costs so much. Now, we've been able to alleviate some of this in our experience here because we've gotten really efficient. We've learned the routes that we can take and how to get to them and how to get back, when to go, when to stay, how often those thrift stores over there rotate their inventory so we can plan a weekly or every other week trip there rather than every day. That was one of the big mistakes I made early on. I tried to go to the local thrift stores every single day. And so I was traveling, hour and a half of driving all the way around the circuit every day, and didn't find a whole lot. I never missed any of the good stuff that ever came out, but I spent so much money trying to get that buying that item almost made no sense. So we've learned how to become efficient. And if you're going to be in a rural environment, you really have to do it that way. You have to be efficient. You have to learn the thrift stores. You have to find the thrift stores that nobody else knows about. That's one of the hardest things to do, because you got to actually have experience, and you have to test things. You have to travel there, see if it's there, see if it's not there. What are their hours? How many thrift stores have I gone to that I got there an hour after they closed at 2 p.m. in the afternoon because they're a small little thrift store? So you have to plan that out in the rural environments. In the city, you can pretty much thrift from like 8 or 9 in the morning all the way to 8 or 9, in some places 10 o'clock at night. So that is an advantage as far as costs of doing business that the city resellers do have. Now, I say all this to say it is possible to be a reseller in a rural environment. You do have to plan, and you do have to sacrifice, and you do have to do things a little bit different than the city folks, but it can be done. You have to learn how to find creative sources for finding inventory. That might be going on Facebook, putting up a sign, putting an ad in a local paper. Flea markets are often overlooked a lot of times for certain types of goods. So you have to be creative on how you get your products sometimes, because the products aren't always in the places that they are in the city, and that just requires time, effort, and trial and error. So how about you? Are you a rural reseller? Are you a city reseller? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear what your experience is. Have you done the rural thing? Have you done the city thing? And which do you think is easier? Which do you think is harder? What are the advantages and pros and cons? Let me know in the comments. But thank you guys for listening. We'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.